Usually I begin by changing the title. This time I have the same title on the screen as in my notes, which is rare. Modern architectural theory, education, and practice have regarded architecture as visually idealized and aestheticized spaces, material structures and forms, and have primarily studied the historical, functional, technical, and formal characteristics. These analyses have focused on architecture as physical objects and spaces. I got lost here. As architecture does not possess a comprehensive theory of its own, the point of view and method of research have usually been borrowed from other disciplines in accordance with changing interests and fashions. Often the applicability of the chosen theoretical frameworks have been highly questionable in the specific embodied reality of architecture. For instance, in the case of the linguistic and the deconstructionist theories. Architecture and scientific criteria. Although I am frequently introduced as a theoretician, I dare to question the feasibility of a comprehensive theory of architecture. Due to the inherent internal complexities, contradictions, and irreconcilabilities of this phenomenon. Through the relative artistic autonomy and focus, the fine arts are fundamentally less complex and contradictory in their ontological grounding than architecture. The inherent internal complexity of architectural projects was pointed out by my great countryman Alvarado in 1955 in his inaugural speech as the member of the Academy of Finland, when he wrote or said, "Whatever our task, whether large or small, in every case, opposites must be reconciled. Almost every formal assignment involves dozens, often hundreds, sometimes thousands of conflicting elements that can be forced into functional harmony only by an act of will. This harmony cannot be achieved by any other means than art. The final value of individual technical and mechanical elements can only be assessed afterwards. A harmonious result cannot be achieved with mathematics, statistics, or probability calculus." End of Aalto quote. Aalto's declaration 60 years ago is rather of the supremacy of art over science, was a courageous statement considering that some of the finest scientists and thinkers in our country were in the audience, like the famous mathematician Rolf Nevalinna, known all over the world. Aalto's view of the integrating power of art has recently been supported by Vittorio Gallese, whose interview we So a moment ago, one of the discoverers of the mirror neurons. This is what, this is Alvarado. Vittorio Gallese writes, from a certain point of view, art is more powerful than science. With much less expensive tools and with greater power of synthesis, artistic intuitions show us who we are, probably in a much more exhaustive way with respect to the objectifying approach of the natural sciences. Being human squares with the ability to ask ourselves who we are. Since the beginning of the mankind, artistic creativity has expressed such ability in its purest and highest form. The inherent scientific nature of architecture, the inherently unscientific nature of architecture arises from the fact that its practice fuses facts and dreams, knowledge and beliefs, rationality and intuition, as well as the temporal dimensions of past, present, and future. Besides, it is simultaneously the means and the end. The means to achieve its utilitarian and practical purpose, and the end as an artistic manifestation that mediates experiential, cultural, mental, and emotional qualities and values. In short, architecture is conceptually an impure and messy as phenomenon of human activity is too impure and too messy to be logically structured within a single theory. A theory of architecture sounds to me as impossible and ultimately useless as a theory of life. As a consequence of its complexity, architecture is bound to arise from an interactive and embodied action that fuses rationality and feeling, knowledge and intuition, empathy and imagination, rather than from an inclusive theory and fully rationalized processes. There can well be theory-based and fully rational aspects of the design process, but in its entirety the process is iteratively synthetic. Architectural design as a creative process in general is guided by a subjective self-piloting action and an immersive embodied identification with the concrete task that fuses aspects of irreconcilable categories rather than an application of a theory-based, rational, methodical, and predictable procedure. The design process is not a rational path, as it consists of countless repeated deviations, dead ends, new beginnings, hesitations, temporary certainties, and a gradual emergence of an acceptable goal as the result of the process itself. The structure and potential potential essence of the design task is gradually revealed as the design response emerges. The questions and answers are formulated simultaneously, and both are subject to the creative process. Simply, due to the essential existential content of architecture, the design cannot be a smooth, rational problem-solving process. All buildings that move us are usually closer to personal confessions than problem solving. The poetic and phenomenological approach. The phenomenon of architecture has also been approached through subjective and personal encounters in a poetic, aphoristic, or essayistic manner, as in the writings of many of the leading architects from Frank Lloyd Wright and Le Corbusier to Alvar Aalto and Louis Kahn, and further to Stephen Hall and Peter Zumthor. In these writings, architecture is approached in a poetic and metaphorical manner without any ambitions or qualifications as scientific research. These writings usually arise from personal experiences, observations, and projections of life. I must personally confess that these personal and often confessional accounts have valorized the holistic, existential, and poetic essence of architecture to me more than the theoretical or empirical studies that claim to satisfy the criteria of science. Historically, there are three categories of seeking meaning: myth and religion, art and science. And there's very little interaction between the three categories. And these endeavors are fundamentally incomparable with each other. The poetic, experiential, and existential core of art and architecture has to be confronted, lived and felt, rather than understood and formalized intellectually. There are surely numerous aspects in construction, in its performance, structural reality, as well as formal and dimensional properties, as well as distinct psychological impacts that can be studied and probably should be studied scientifically. But the experiential, mental, and existential meaning of the entity can only be encountered and experienced. During the past few decades, an experiential approach based on phenomenological encounters and first-person experiences of buildings and settings has gained ground. This thinking is initially based on the philosophies of Edmund Husserl, Martin Heidegger, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, Gaston Bachelard, and many other philosophical thinkers. The phenomenological approach, which also acknowledges the significant role of embodiment, was introduced in architectural contexts by such writers as Sten Eiler Rasmussen, Christian Norberg Schultz, Charles Moore, David Seaman, Robert Mugerauer, Karsten Harris, and others. I also believe that the book entitled Questions of Perception of 1994 by Stephen Hall, Alberto Perez Gomez, and myself helped to spread this manner of thinking, especially in schools of architecture internationally. The poetic and existential dimension of architecture is a mental quality, and this artistic and mental essence of architecture emerges in the individual encounter with an experience of the work. In the beginning of his seminal book, Art as Experience of 1934, John Dewey, the visionary American pragmatist philosopher, argues, in common conception, the work of art is often identified with the building, book, painting, or statue in its existence apart from human experience. Since the actual work of art is what the product does with and in experience, the result is not favorable to understanding. When artistic objects are separated from both conditions of origin and operation in experience, a wall is built around them that renders almost opaque their general significance, with which aesthetic theory deals, unquote. Here the philosopher connects the condition of making a piece of art and its later encounter by someone else. As in both cases, the mental and experiential reality dominates and the work exists nakedly as a human experience. The philosopher suggests that the difficulties in understanding artistic phenomena arise from the tradition of studying them as objects outside of human experience and consciousness. Dewey writes further, by common consent, the Parthenon is a great work of art, yet it has aesthetic standing only as the work becomes an experience for a human being. Art is always the product in experience of an interaction of human beings with their environments. Architecture is a notable instance of the reciprocity of the result in this interaction. The reshaping of subsequent experience by architectural works is more direct and more extensive than in the case of any other arts. They not only influence the future, but they record and convey the past. Here Dewey even assigns an actively conditioning role to architecture in relation to the nature of experience itself, as well as to our understanding of the passing of time and history. I have formulated this view with the argument that architecture creates frames and horizons for perception, experience, and understanding the specific human condition. And consequently, instead of being the end product, it has essentially a mediating role. This was also Sarah's point earlier. The significance of the time dimension and temporal experience has not usually been sufficiently acknowledged in studies of architecture. Carsten Harris, the philosopher, his statement on the mental meaning of time in architecture is significant when he writes, "Architecture is not only about domesticating space. it is also a deep defense against the terror of time. The language of beauty is essentially the language of timeless reality. For me, the notion terror of time has become a very important notion when I think about the task of architecture. Architecture is one of our strongest means to fight that terror, the fall of Icarus into the endlessness of time. Since Siegfried Gideon's Space, Time and Architecture, the art of building has been theorized in terms of the space-time continuum as defined in modern physics, but the dimension of time has also its independent mental role in our experience of life and architecture. We have a deep existential need to feel rooted in time as much as in space. We dwell in both space and time, and both dimensions are articulated and domesticated for human purposes by architecture. Architecture tames the immensity of space and endlessness of time for human mind to tolerate. The significance of experience has been grasped in other art forms such as theater, cinema, and music, but it has not been understood in relation to such material and utilitarian objects as buildings and larger environments. Encountering architecture. The experiential approach focuses on the encounter of the architectural reality and the experiencing person and mind, and in accordance with Dewey's view, this actualizes the architectural dimension. The phenomenological method attempts to approach phenomena without preconceptions and to identify with sensitivity the emergence of emotion and meaning in this unique personal encounter. Beyond its construction in experience, beyond its constitution in experience, architecture mediates between the outer world and the inner realm of the self, projecting frames of perception and understanding. This interchange is necessarily an exchange. As I enter a space, the space enters me and changes me. My experience and my self-understanding. Mediation is essential in all art, and Maurice Merleau-Ponty states firmly, we come to see not the work of art, but the world according to the work. The philosopher's view rejects the regrettably common understanding of art and architecture as artistic self-expression. This is an essential point. The meaning of art and architecture is outside of the work itself, and it always reaches beyond itself. A fundamental starting point in the experiential approach to art and architecture is the fusion or continuum of the physical and the mental, the outer and the inner realms, without categoric boundaries. Rainer Maria Rilke, in my mind, the finest poet of all time, used the beautiful notion Welt Innenraum, the inner mentally experienced interior space of the world. Artistic experience creates these inner worlds. Merleau-Ponty tells us enigmatically, the world is wholly inside and I am wholly outside of myself. This seems to point at the chiasmatic intertwining of the outer and the inner realms. Profound architects have always intuitively understood that buildings structure, reorient and attune our mental realities. The fact that artists have intuited mental and neural phenomena often decades before psychology or neuroscience have identified them is the subject matter of Jonah Lehrer's thought-provoking book, Proust Was a Neuroscientist. In his pioneering book, Survival Through Design, which we already heard about earlier, published more than 6 decades ago, Richard Neudra already acknowledges the biological and neurological realities and makes a suggestion that is surprising for its time when he writes, "Our time is characterized by a systematic rise of the biological sciences and is turning away from oversimplified and mechanistic views of the 18th and 19th centuries. An important result of this view, this new way of regarding this business of living, may be to bear and raise appropriate working principles and criteria for design." Later he also professed, "Today design may exert a far-reaching influence on the nervous makeup of generations." Alvarado intuited the biological ground of architecture also in his statement, "I would like to, quote, I would like to add my personal emotional view that architecture and its details are in some way all part of biology." The direct impact of settings on the human nervous system and brain has been proven by research in today's neuroscience. While the brain controls our behavior and genes control the blueprint for the design and structure of the brain, the environment can modulate the function of the genes and ultimately the structure of the brain. Changes in the environment change the brain and therefore they change our behavior. In planning the environments in which we live, architectural design changes our brain and our behavior. This statement by Fred Gage, neuroscientist, leads to the most crucial realization when designing physical reality. We are, in fact, also designing experiential and mental realities, and external structures condition and alter internal structures. This realization heightens the human responsibility in the architect's work. I myself used to see buildings as aestheticized objects, but for 3 decades now, architectural images have been primarily mental images or experiences of the human condition and mind. I have also gradually understood the significance of the designer's empathic capacity, the gift to simulate and emphasize and empathize with the experience of the little man, to use Alvar Aalto's notion. Aalto often referred to the little man as his final client. This interface between the material and the mental worlds is so fundamental that philosophers and neuroscientists such as Alva Noe increasingly see the continuum to constitute the human consciousness, whereas Dewey argued thought-provokingly, the mind is a verb. I wish to argue that architecture is also a verb, as its true essence is always an invitation to action and specific guidance or choreography of that action. It is this verb-like tendency towards active search and exploration that unifies architecture and the human mind. Architecture is always also a promise, a pledge, and an offer of human order, predictability, and security, both physical and mental. Until recently, architecture has primarily been seen as a visual art form experienced and judged by vision. This view is represented most notably by Le Corbusier in his credo, quote, "Architecture is the masterly, correct, and magnificent play of masses brought together in light," unquote. The hegemony of vision has been pointed out by a number of contemporary thinkers, such as David Michael Levin and Martin Jay. I have also written extensively on the often forceful dominance of vision in the Western industrial and consumerist culture, and argued that the directional sense of vision makes us observers and outsiders, whereas the omnidirectional impressing senses of hearing, touch, smell, and even taste turn us into insiders and participants. We can also suspect that the unfocused peripheral vision is more important than focused vision for the experience of being in space or the sense of participation and belonging. I wrote this before I listened to your lecture, and thank you for the proof on this idea. Merleau-Ponty finally brought all the senses together in his understanding of sensory perception. Quote, "My perception is not a sum of visual, tactile, and audible givens. I perceive in a total way with my whole being. I grasp a unique structure of the thing, a unique way of being, which speaks to all my senses at once." End of quote. After having investigated the phenomenon, and I'll show just one image of my own designs. After having investigated the phenomenon of architecture for 50 years as an architect, writer, and teacher, I have no hesitation in arguing today that our most important sense in architectural experience is not vision, but our extended haptic sense, the existential sense, our sense of bodily being and self. Architecture is primarily an experience of our embodied sense of being, of our experience of being in the world, rather than merely of vision or any other of the 5 Aristotelian senses in separation. In Merleau-Ponty's statement above, his expression, "I perceive with my whole being," seems to suggest such an embodied and unified existential experience. It is becoming evident that the encounter and that we encounter and judge environments and architecture through our most synthetic sense, our sense of being and self. Merleau-Ponty's notion of the flesh of the world makes this view understandable when Merleau-Ponty writes, quote, "Our own body is in the world as the heart is in the organism. It keeps the visible spectacle constantly alive. It breathes life into it and sustains it inwardly, and with it forms a system," unquote. Yes, we exist in this flesh of the world and grasp our existence through being part of that very flesh. Merleau-Ponty suggests poetically that Paul Cézanne's paintings make us feel how the world touches us. I wish to add that architecture goes even a step further, as it enables us to dwell in the flesh of the world itself, not only touching it. Architecture gives us our domicile in this existential flesh, both physically and mentally. Architecture also activates and strengthens our sense of self, as the experience is always individual, contextual, and unique. Art and architecture seem to be always addressing each one of us individually. Besides, if you notice, when you are really struck by a powerful architectural experience, it silences the world. You are alone in total silence, independent of where you are. Art and architecture, yes. Besides, if I am unable to project meaning into my encounter with a place, space, or building, there is really no architecture, just the physical construction or setting. This is a non-place, to use the notion of Edward Relf. The imaginative experience of the spaces and events experienced when reading a novel is the most impressive capacity of the human imagination and mind. While reading, we keep constructing objects, rooms, houses, cities, and entire continents. And even more miraculously, we create the flesh in which these events are embedded. We architects should study how great writers make us not only enter literary realities, but construct them in our imaginations. There is now a growing interest in at least some European architecture schools about architecture and literature, and exactly this fantastic literary capacity of imagination. We need to learn to see imagine and feel drawings as experienced and lived, but that calls for a capacity of imagination elevated to second power. As Jean-Paul Sartre argues, when I'm reading Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, I project my own sense of frustrated waiting on the character of Raskolnikov. This capacity of literature to evoke and mediate experiences of spaces, places, and situations has been recently studied by Elaine Scarry. And she writes, in order to achieve the vivacity of the material world, the verbal arts must somehow also imitate its persistence and most crucially, its quality of givenness. It seems almost certainly the case that it is the instructional character of the verbal arts that fulfills this mimetic requirement for givenness. When I feel deep and moving melancholy in Michelangelo's Laurentian library, it is my own sense of melancholy that I am confronting, released and amplified by the embodied gestural language of the great architect. I can even say that I feel through the muscles of Michelangelo as his buildings, shapes and profiles secretly gesture as if they were parts of the human body. The great gift of art is that we can momentarily experience and feel the world and ourselves as articulated through the sensitivity of a great artist. We can see with the eyes of Piero della Francesca, feel with the muscles of Michelangelo, and hear with the ears of Bach. This is the great gift of art to humanity. Perception, experience, and imagination. Perceptions are not experiences, as they are mere registrations of stimuli without contextualization, judgment, and meaning. Sense perceptions interact with distinct connections and meanings. In architectural design work, the most demanding and valuable skill is to intuit and simulate the experience of the physically non-existent entity. Again, intuiting the experience of a single form or object is relatively easy, whereas imagining the entire atmosphere or feeling of a wide and complex spatial entity calls for extraordinary imaginative skills. The imaginative and intuitive experience calls for the capacity of empathy. The notion of empathy was introduced in the aesthetic theories of the late 19th century, but it has been bypassed during the entire modern era. I don't know any architecture school where empathy would be taught, but it should be taught in every architecture school. However, along with the current interest in experience, also the interest in empathy is now emerging, and in my view, should be taught in architecture school. It is not enough to imagine your own feeling, but as you need to imagine the experience and feeling of the other. It has taken a long time to realize how we actually experience the world and architecture as part of it, because we have been misguided by the view of our 5 separate senses as defined by Aristotle. We can point an organic, physiological sense organ for each one of our 5 classical senses, whereas we cannot point an organ for our atmospheric experience, existential sense, or sense of being, as they all arise from a synthetic understanding of being in the world. Even the blind and the deaf are able to experience their fully embodied existence. However, Steinerian philosophy categorizes 12 senses, and one of them is the ego sense and a self-movement sense. And in my view, these 3 non-Aristotelian senses together constitute the existential sense through which architecture is primarily experienced. Besides, the received understanding of the functioning of the senses seems too simplistic and, in the light of recent studies, often entirely wrong. But discussing this subject would take me too far from the focus of my lecture. The cardinal mistake is the prevailing understanding of our experience of the world as a picture. This is something that already Heidegger dealt with. It suffices here to just mention that philosopher Alva Noe presents the dramatic question in the title of one of his books: Is the visual world a grand illusion? This is a shocking question for us architects to think about, how critical we might be of Alva Noe's thinking. Relational phenomena and understanding entities. I think this is my last chapter. This gradual expansion of our understanding of the senses, their functioning and interactions, and the consequent changes in our understanding of experience reminds me of the problem of localizing human consciousness. In another book of his, Alva Noe argues that scientists have not succeeded in localizing human consciousness because they have been searching its location in a wrong place, inside the brain. In Noah's view, and I believe he's right, consciousness cannot be localized at all because it is not a thing, but a relational phenomenon emerging between the human mind and the world. I suggest that artistic experience is similarly a relational phenomenon between the poetic object and the experiencing mind. Atmospheric experience is also a difficult phenomenon because it is a relational experience, not a definable, nameable, and measurable object or thing. It is a quasi-thing, to quote the title of Tonino Grifero's recent book, which is entitled Quasi-things, and the subtitle, The Paradigm of Atmospheres. It also arises from relations and interactions of numerous irreconcilable factors, such as scale, materiality, tactility, illumination, temperature, humidity, sound, color, smell, etc., which together constitute the atmosphere, or actually our experience of it. We must confess now that all artistic and poetic experiences are similarly relational experiences, and their essences, meanings, and emotive characteristics arise from a dynamic interaction of numerous factors and qualities with the human neural system and consciousness to constitute an experience. The poetic and artistic experience also always activates our deepest collective and biological memories. Our experiences resonate with our personal and human histories. An interest in the phenomena of atmosphere, ambience, feelings, moods, and attunements, as well as in the understanding of the real multisensory and simultaneous nature of perception is emerging. This new interest in experience is shifting research from form and formal structures to emotive and dynamic experiences and mental processes, and from form to processes and becoming. It is evident that when the focus shifts from the physical reality and form to the mental reality and emotion, also the methodology of the study is bound to change. In the study of the experiential essence of art and architecture, relevant philosophical perspectives, as well as an understanding and intuiting of perceptual and mental phenomena, memory and imagination are called for. In order to understand human experience, we must shift from the quasi-scientific processes of measuring to the courage and desire to live and confront architecture directly through our very act of living. Thank you.